Call came in on a gray Tuesday in November, the kind of Halifax afternoon where the harbor goes the color of dishwater and the freezing rain can't decide whether to be snow. I was at my kitchen table going over numbers when the phone buzzed with a number I didn't have saved. I almost let it ring out. Something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the wind was rattling the storm windows, or maybe it was that old animal thing in a mother, the cord that never fully gets cut no matter how hard somebody pulls on it. Rosalind. That was the first word out of her. Not mom. Not even a hello. Just my name, said flat, like she was reading it off a form. I knew the voice the second I heard it, even though it had deepened and hardened in the 26 years since I'd last heard it up close. You don't forget the sound of your own child. I'd carried it around in my chest like a stone the whole time. It's your daughter, she said, in case I'd somehow failed to understand. I'm getting married in June. I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that silence makes people show you who they are. I thought you'd want to come, she went on, and there it was, the little curl at the edge of the words, the thing I've been waiting for. Everyone's heard so much about you over the years. I think it's only fair they finally get to see the woman behind all the stories, the convict, the one who walked out on her little girl. You can sit at the back and watch me have the life you never gave me. I want to tell you I felt my heart break. The honest truth is, I felt something closer to a door swinging open. I laughed. Not a big laugh, not a wild one, just a quiet sound, low in my throat, the kind you make when somebody finally hands you exactly what you've been praying for, and they don't even know they're doing it. I'll be there, I said, and I hung up before she could say another word. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that, watching the rain slide down the glass, and I thought about how a person spends a quarter of a century waiting for one phone call, and when it comes, it isn't an apology, it isn't a question, it's a knife held out handle first. My daughter thought she was inviting a beaten old woman to sit in the back row of a church and be pointed at. What she'd actually done was send a formal invitation to her own undoing. She'd given me a room full of witnesses and a date on the calendar. After 26 years of building in the dark, I finally had somewhere to stand in a light. To understand why she said the word convict the way she did, like it tasted bad in her mouth, you have to come back with me to the beginning, to the girl I used to be before the world decided what I was. I grew up in a row house in the north end of Halifax, the kind of street where everybody's father worked the docks or the rail yard and everybody's mother stretched a chicken across 3 suppers. I married up, or I thought I did. Her father came from a family that owned a seafood processing operation out on the eastern shore, the kind of business that had a name painted on the side of a building and a pew with their name on it at the church. They had money, or the look of money, which in a small place is almost the same thing. His mother shook my hand at the engagement supper and told me, smiling the whole time, that she hoped I understood the family had a reputation to protect. I was 23. I thought she was being kind. When my daughter was born, I poured everything I had into her. I'm not going to pretend I was a perfect mother. I lost my temper. I burned suppers. There were nights I cried in the bathroom with the tap running so nobody would hear. But I was there. I was the one who sat up with her when the croup came on. The one who walked her to school in the salt and the slush. The one who took the early shift at the fish plant and the late shift cleaning offices downtown so there'd be money for her ballet and her braces. Her father's family looked at all that work and saw only that I'd married into them with nothing. To them, I was a draft coming in under the door. The thing that ended my life as I knew it started in the back office of that seafood operation. Her father had been skimming, cooking the books, taking cash off the top, borrowing against the company on terms no honest man would sign. When the auditors finally came around and the numbers wouldn't add up, the family didn't hesitate for a second. They needed somebody to hand the auditors, and they weren't about to hand them one of their own. So they handed them me. I had done the company's bookkeeping for a couple of years, part-time, around my other jobs. That was all the rope they needed. Suddenly, there were my initials on documents I'd never seen, deposits in an account I'd never opened, a paper trail laid out so neat it could only have been built on purpose. Her father sat across the table from the investigators and let them ask their questions. And when it came time to say my wife didn't do this, he looked at his folded hands and said nothing at all. His silence was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I'll never forget the morning they came for me. There was frost on the inside of the windows. My daughter was 8 years old, standing in the hallway in her nightgown with her hair all tangled from sleep. And she was screaming for me as the officer walked me out to the car. I twisted around to look at her, and her grandmother had her by the shoulders, turning her away, covering her ears, the way you'd shield a child from something filthy. That was the last clear look I got of my little girl for 26 years. Her face, wet and terrified, being turned away from me by the very people who'd put me in that car. The trial was a formality. They had the money for lawyers, and I had a legal aid fellow with too many files and not enough hours. They had standing in the community, and I had a North End accent and a record of working 3 jobs that somehow got twisted into proof I was desperate enough to steal. Her father's family filled 2 rows of the gallery in their good coats. When the verdict came down, his mother actually dabbed at her eyes, like she was the one who'd been wronged. They gave me 4.5 years at the women's institution up near Truro. My daughter was handed entirely to her father, and from that day on, I stopped being her mother. I became a story they told her, a warning, a reason to lock the door at night. Prison is its own country with its own weather. You learn fast. You learn to keep your eyes down and your mouth shut and your back to the wall. You learn whose tray you don't touch and whose name you don't say. But none of that was the worst of it. The worst of it was the mailbox. That first Christmas inside, I told myself she'd send something, a drawing, a card with crooked letters. I lined up at mail call like a fool, 3 days running, asking the same officer if anything had come. Nothing. The next Christmas, nothing. The third year, I stopped going to mail call altogether. I'd sit on my bunk and listen to the other women crying over photographs of their kids, and I'd hold very still and stare at the ceiling and tell myself it didn't touch me. It touched me. It touched everything. I wrote to her. God, I wrote to her. Long letters in my best handwriting, telling her about the time she'd put her boots on the wrong feet and refused to switch, about the lullaby my own mother used to sing, about how much I loved her, how none of it was true, how I was coming back. I found out later that most of those letters never made it past her grandmother's kitchen table. The few that might have gotten through, I'll never know if she read them or burned them. Word about her reached me sideways, the way news travels in a place like this. A woman whose sister knew a woman who lived 2 streets over from her father's family. My daughter was doing well in school. She'd made the swim team. She'd started calling her father's new girlfriend Mom. Every scrap of it was a gift and a wound at the same time. I was glad she was warm and fed and clothed, and every single update was another reminder that I was a ghost in my own daughter's house. I had a lot of rage in there. Rage at her father for being a coward. Rage at his family for being the kind of people who'd sacrifice a young mother to protect a sign painted on a building. Rage at my daughter, too, though I was ashamed of it, for believing them. That rage could have eaten me alive. Plenty of women in there let it. But somewhere in the second year, lying on my bunk listening to the heating pipes knock, I made myself a different kind of promise. I decided that the last thing they were ever going to get to do was watch me disappear. If the world had decided I was nothing, then one day I was going to make myself impossible to ignore. I didn't know how yet. I just knew the story wasn't going to end on their terms. I walked out of that institution on a raw March morning with $200 in an envelope, a bus ticket, and a criminal record that followed me around like a smell. Nobody was waiting at the gate. I stood in the parking lot with my breath hanging in the air, and the snow still gray along the edges of the lot, and I understood, all the way down to my boots, that I was on my own. I got a bed in a halfway house in Dartmouth, 4 women to a room, rules tighter than the institution I just left. Every morning, I put on the one decent blouse I owned and went out with a list of addresses. I learned in a hurry what happens to a person's face when you check the box that says you've been convicted. The manager at the call center, the supervisor at the warehouse, the woman at the bakery counter. You watch the warmth drain right out of them. So I took what nobody else wanted. I cleaned motel rooms out by the highway where the guests looked through me like I was furniture. I mopped the floors of office towers downtown after everybody'd gone home, pushing a bucket down a hallway, humming to myself so the quiet wouldn't get its hooks in me. I bussed tables at a diner where I once served coffee to a man I'd gone to high school with and watched him not recognize me at all. It wasn't dignified. It was survival. And in this country, if you're willing to work and you're willing to learn and you've got the patience of a stone, survival can turn into something else. At night, while the younger women at the halfway house were out chasing whatever was going to get them sent back, I'd sit under the buzzing light in the common room with library books spread across the table. Books on real estate, books on small business, a dog-eared paperback about money that I read so many times the cover came off. I'd copy out terms I didn't understand and look them up the next day on the public computers at the branch on Alderney Drive. I told myself that whatever else they'd taken, they couldn't reach inside my head and take what I learned. Knowledge was the one thing I owned outright. The world wasn't done with me, mind you. At the grocery store, a woman pulled her cart back like I was contagious. On the bus, I heard somebody whisper my name, and you know what she did. Shame walked behind me everywhere I went, but I decided shame could follow me all it liked, as long as it never got in front. I saved like a woman possessed. I cut my own hair. I walked instead of taking the bus when the weather allowed. I wore the same 2 skirts until they shined at the seams. And little by little, dollar by dollar, I built a cushion. The day I finally moved out of the halfway house and into a 1-bedroom apartment in the North End, back in my old part of town, I stood in the doorway with the key in my hand and I wept, not from sorrow, from the plain dignity of a door that was mine to lock. The thing that changed my life started, of all places, at a kitchen table where I was scrubbing somebody else's grout. I'd taken on a few cleaning jobs for private homes by then, and one of my clients was a young couple who traveled a lot for work. One evening, I heard them talking about renting out their condo while they were away, listing it online for visitors coming in off the cruise ships and the conference trade. They'd made nearly a month's mortgage in 2 weekends, the husband said, like it was nothing. I went home that night and couldn't sleep for thinking about it. A month's mortgage in 2 weekends. I had a 1-bedroom apartment that I lived in alone. The next morning, I went to the library and read everything I could find. The idea was simple to the point of seeming impossible. You make a room nice, you put it online, you host people coming through town, and they pay you. Who on earth, I thought, would want to stay in my little place with its drafty windows and its view of a parking lot? But I borrowed a camera from one of my clients, and I scrubbed that apartment until it gleamed, and I bought a quilt and a lamp and a few prints of the thrift shop down on Goddington Street, and I learned how to take a photograph that made the place look bigger and brighter than it was. I priced it low because I was sure nobody would bite. Within a week, I had my first booking. A couple from Ontario in town for a wedding who slept in the bed I'd made with shaking hands and left me a glowing review and $40 extra on the counter for being a wonderful host. That $40 might as well have been 40,000. It cracked something open in me. I stopped seeing my apartment as a place I survived in and started seeing it as a thing that could earn. When my lease came up, I didn't renew it. I found a 2-bedroom instead, slept in the small room, and rented the big one out year-round. My neighbors thought I'd lost my mind, letting strangers in. They couldn't see what I could see. Every stranger was one rung higher on a ladder I was building out of nothing. I worked harder in those years than I'd ever worked in my life. And I'd already worked hard enough for 3 people. Cleaning jobs by day, hosting by night, scrubbing between guests, washing sheets at the laundromat at midnight because I couldn't afford a machine yet, managing my bookings on the library computers because I couldn't afford internet at home. My hands cracked and bled from the cold and the bleach. My back went out twice. But every time a payment landed, I felt the tide turning, an inch at a time. Inside of 3 years, I'd saved enough to take over the lease on a whole house in a part of town the young people were starting to move into. I furnished it room by room, listed the whole thing, and it filled. Then I did it again and again. I learned which streets were coming up and which were going down. I learned how to read a landlord, how to talk to a contractor, how to spot a tired old place with good bones that everybody else was walking past. I bought my first property outright, a beat-up duplex out toward the Bedford Highway, with cash I'd saved $100 at a time, and I fixed it up myself with library videos and a borrowed drill. What nobody tells you is that a woman with a record and a North End accent is invisible to exactly the people who'd otherwise try to stop her. The banks turned me down flat, so I learned to do without them, partnering quietly, holding things in numbered companies, building under names that didn't draw a second glance. When somebody looked up the woman who'd gone to prison all those years ago, all they ever found was a ghost. Meanwhile, that ghost was buying up half-empty buildings across the Maritimes, in Halifax and Moncton and Charlottetown and out into Cape Breton, turning them into the kind of places visitors lined up to stay in. By the time I was into my late 50s, I had a portfolio that would have stopped my old neighbors' hearts, but I never once flaunted it. I drove a sensible car. I lived in a comfortable but ordinary house. I gave to the food bank and the women's shelter every single month, anonymously, because I knew exactly how cold the world gets when you've got nothing. I didn't want my picture in the business pages. I declined every interview, every award, every Chamber of Commerce breakfast, because I understood something her father's family never would. Power is worth the most when you reveal it at the exact right moment and not a second before. I won't pretend I'd let go of her. The only person who knew the whole of me in those years was my sister, who'd stood by me through the trial when everyone else turned away, and who used to sit at my table with a cup of tea and tell me, gently, that I'd built a kingdom and still couldn't sleep at night. "You've made all this," she said to me once, waving her hand at the folders of deeds I kept in the dining room. "And you're still chained to a girl who won't even say your name out loud." I couldn't argue with her. I'd turned my silence into success, but I hadn't turned it into peace. I knew where my daughter lived. I knew she'd gone into nursing, that she was good at it, that she had her father's chin and, God help me, my mother's hands. I'd driven past her street more than once in the dark, slow, just to see the light on in her window, and then driven home feeling like a thief. I never knocked. I never called. I just wondered, the way you wonder about weather you can't see coming, whether she hated me or worse, whether she never thought of me at all. So when her voice came down that phone line in November, sharp and cold and certain it was holding all the cards, I understood that the moment my sister kept telling me would come had finally arrived. My daughter wanted to put me in the back row and let a room full of strangers look at the wretched old woman she'd been raised to despise. She'd handed me a stage and called it a humiliation. I started getting ready that very night. I did it the way I did everything by then, with a list and a clear head and no trembling. I called the man who'd handled security for some of my higher-end properties and told him I'd need 2 of his best for a day in June. Discreet, sharp, the kind of men who silence a room just by standing in the corner of it. He didn't ask me why. He'd known me long enough to know I never spent money on theater for its own sake. I arranged for a car, not because I needed one, but because of what it would say before I ever opened my mouth. A black Bentley, long and low and quiet as a held breath, the kind of machine that turns every head in a parking lot full of decent sedans. Let them wonder, I thought. Let them lean over and whisper to each other. Who is that? Which one of the family knows somebody like that, right up until the door opens and the answer steps out. I had a suit made. Not bought, made. by a woman downtown who measured not just my shoulders and my waist, but the way I stood, the way I carried my head. Deep charcoal, cut so clean it looked like it could draw blood. Low heels I could actually walk in because I had no intention of wobbling. And round my throat, the single string of pearls I'd bought myself the year I made my first real money, the only luxury I'd ever allowed myself, sitting in a drawer for over a decade, waiting. And then I did the other thing, the harder thing. I went to my safety deposit box at the credit union and took out a thin folder I'd been adding to for years. Because somewhere along the line, when I was buying up distressed properties for pennies on the dollar, I'd come across a debt for sale. Her father's seafood operation, the family business with the name painted on the building, had been failing for a long time, propped up on loans and bad bookkeeping, the same habits that had once sent me to prison. I bought the note quietly through one of my numbered companies. I'd owned the ground under that family's pride for almost 2 years, and not one of them knew it. Inside that same folder were the original records, the real ones. The documents a forensic accountant I'd hired had pulled together over 3 patient years. The paper that proved, in clean black numbers, that the initials on those old documents had never been written by my hand, that the account had been opened by her father using my name, that I had been framed by the very people sitting in the good pews. I'd never used it. I hadn't known what I was waiting for. Now I knew. The wedding was at a waterfront club out past the basin, the kind of place with a long gravel drive and white tents and a view of the harbor that costs more than most people make in a season. I came late on purpose, after everyone was seated, when the absence of a guest is most noticed and most filled in by gossip. The June light was gold off the water, and the gulls were wheeling, and the gravel crunched under the tires as the Bentley rolled up to the entrance, and I watched through the tinted glass as heads began to turn. My driver came around and opened the door. One of my security men stepped out first, broad as a doorframe in a black suit, and the murmur started before I had even put a foot on the ground. The second man followed, sweeping the crowd with a flat, patient look that quieted the nearest tables. And then I got out. I felt the air change. I'd dressed in war, and I knew it. I held my chin level and my back straight, and I walked toward that tent the way I'd once been walked away from my own front door, except this time nobody was turning my face away from anything. The pearls sat cool at my throat. My heels clicked on the flagstone steady as a clock. The bride's side of the family didn't know me from Eve. They smiled the polite, uncertain smiles of people who assume an arriving stranger in a Bentley must be somebody important. But on the groom's side, on her side, the recognition came rolling through like a wave hitting the rocks. I heard the sharp intake of breath first. Then I saw her father. He was an old man now, gone soft and gray, his good coat straining at the buttons, but the arrogance was still there in the set of his jaw, sitting right next to a fear I'd never seen on him in my life. His mouth came open. The color ran out of his face. And then I saw her. My daughter, in her white dress, turned to see what everyone was looking at. Our eyes met across that gathering of strangers, and the smug little smile she'd been carrying around all morning died on her lips. She'd been expecting a broken woman in a thrift store coat, somebody to point at and pity herself for having to tolerate. She had not been expecting her mother to walk in out of a black car looking like she owned the harbor. Her hand went out and gripped the back of a chair. For a second, I honestly thought her knees might go. I didn't go to her. I didn't go to him. I walked straight up the aisle of that tent, slow and even, and I stopped in front of the bride, this young woman in white who had no idea what kind of family she was marrying into, and I put out my hand. "Congratulations," I said. "I'm the groom's mother." The silence that landed on that tent was a thing you could have leaned on. Glasses stopped halfway to mouths. A fork hung in the air. Every eye in the place swung between my calm face and my daughter's unraveling one. The young bride blinked at me, her hand drifting into mine, soft and bewildered. I didn't know you'd be coming, she said. No, I said gently, because she was the one person in that tent who'd done nothing wrong. I don't imagine you did. My daughter found her voice then, and it came out tight and high. You shouldn't be up here. You can sit at the back, like I said. She was trying to put the leash back on, trying to make me the dog she'd called. I turned and looked at her, just looked, and I waited, the way I'd learned to wait, until the quiet did my work for me. The whole tent was holding its breath now. The string quartet stopped, the servers frozen with their trays. I'll say my piece, I told her, and then I'll go. You can decide afterward what kind of day you want this to have been. I didn't raise my voice. I have never once in my life had to raise my voice to be heard in a room. I just told them the truth. I told them I'd been called a thief and a deserter for the better part of 3 decades. I told them I'd been led out of my own house in handcuffs, while my 8-year-old daughter screamed for me and was turned away by the people who'd put me in that car. I told them I'd gone to prison for money I'd never seen, on documents I'd never signed, while the man who'd actually done it sat in church on Sundays with his hands folded. I watched her father's face go from gray to a sick, mottled red. I watched him start to rise from his chair, and I watched one of my men shift his weight just slightly, and I watched him sit back down. Then I took the folder out of my bag, and I set it on the head table, and I told them exactly what was in it. The forensic accounting, the forged signatures, the account opened in my name by her father's own hand. I told them that the seafood business this family had built their whole sense of themselves on had been failing for years on the very same dishonesty that sent me away, and that the note on it, the debt that kept it breathing, belonged now to me and had for 2 years, and that I could call it tomorrow if I chose. I didn't shout any of it. That was the thing that finished him. I said it the way you'd read a grocery list, and the room understood all at once that everything they'd been told about the wretched woman at the back of the church had been exactly backward. That was when my daughter broke. She came at me with her voice cracking, the bride's bouquet still in her hand. "You left me," she said, and the tears were coming now, ugly and fast. "You went to prison. You weren't there. You don't get to walk in here in ruin." She couldn't even finish it. I let her get it all out. I didn't flinch. And when she ran out of words, I said the only thing left that was true. "I didn't leave you," I said. "I was taken from you. There's a difference, and somewhere along the way, when you were old enough to ask hard questions, you decided not to. You're not a little girl anymore. You're a grown woman with a nursing degree and a mind of your own. And you picked the easy story over the true one because the easy one let you hate me in peace." Her father was the one shaking apart now. His own sisters were edging away from him down the head table. The bride had stepped back from my daughter and was looking at her new husband's whole family like she was seeing them for the first time, which I suppose she was. I picked up my bag. I left the folder where it was, on the table, in front of all of them, because I'd had copies made years ago, and the originals weren't the point. The point was the room. "I don't hate you," I told my daughter, and I meant it, which surprised me. "But I won't be sitting in your back row. Not today, not ever. The bond you and I had, the one from when you were small and your boots were always on the wrong feet, that died a long time ago, in a courtroom, while the people who loved you most lied to your face. I made my peace with my part of it. The rest of it is yours to carry now." She didn't say anything. There was nothing left in her to say. She just stood there in her beautiful white dress, in the wreckage of the day she planned to use to bury me, and I understood, looking at her, that I hadn't ruined her wedding at all. Her father had ruined it 26 years ago. I'd only finally turned the lights on. I walked back down that aisle with my men on either side of me and my heels keeping time on the flagstones, and the gulls were still wheeling over the harbor, and the June light was still gold off the water, and I did not look back. I'd spent more than 2 decades imagining 100 different ways that moment might feel: triumphant, furious, sweet. It wasn't any of those. It was clear, just clear. The way the air gets after a storm finally blows itself out to sea. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole of it, whether I forgave her, whether I forgave him. I tell them the truth, which is that forgiveness was never the thing I was after. Some things don't mend, and a wiser woman than me once said that pretending they can only opens the wound back up. My daughter will remember me however she chooses. The ghost who arrived in a black car. The mother who lit up her wedding day with the truth and walked out before the cake. That's hers to decide. What I know is this: they called me wretched, and they were wrong, and the proof of it isn't the buildings, or the car, or the pearls. The proof is that I lay on a prison bunk staring at a ceiling with $200 and a bus ticket waiting for me on the other side, and I decided I would not disappear. And I didn't. The girl from the North End, who married up and got handed the worst of it, built a whole life out of the ashes they left her in. One cracked-handed, sleepless, $100 night at a time. They turned my own child's face away from me in a doorway one cold morning. It took me 26 years, but in the end, I was the one who got to choose how I walked out of the room, and I walked out tall. The cruelest thing the family ever did to me wasn't the handcuffs or the 4.5 years, or even the silence afterward. It was teaching a little girl that the easy story and the true one are the same thing. Everything that came after grew out of that one lie, the way a single crack in a foundation will eventually run the whole length of a house. Her father chose to save himself, and that choice cost me my freedom. His mother chose to turn my daughter's face away in the doorway, and that choice cost my daughter her mother. None of it was fate. It was decisions, theirs and mine, lining up one after another like dominoes. And every person who could have told the truth and stayed quiet instead is still living with what their quiet built. I think about what carried me through, and it comes down to three plain things, none of them flashy. The first is that I refused to become the liar they'd convicted me of being. When I started buying up tired buildings, I paid my contractors on time. I kept my word. I gave to the shelter every month because I knew that cold from the inside. I could have cut corners the way her father did. I chose not to, and that honest dealing is the only reason banks of partners and tradespeople trusted a woman with my record. Doing right wasn't soft. It was the strongest thing I owned. The second is that I made myself learn, sitting under that buzzing light with library books I half understood, copying out words I had to look up the next day. I taught myself a trade the world swore I had no business in. Nobody handed me that knowing. I went and got it, one slow night at a time, and it turned out that what you carry in your head is the one thing they can never put in handcuffs. The third is the simplest and the hardest. I did not quit. There were nights the loneliness sat on my chest like a wet sandbag, and I wanted to disappear, and I got up the next morning and walked out with my list of addresses anyway. Pennies became a cushion became a duplex became a life. Endurance isn't dramatic. It's just refusing to put the shovel down. If you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this: you will not always get to choose what is done to you. You will always get to choose who it makes you. Stay honest when lying would be faster. Keep learning when ignorance would be easier. And keep standing up long after it stops being fair. Do those three things long enough, and one ordinary Tuesday the phone rings, and you find out you've quietly become the person nobody can put in the back row anymore.